Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tyra Palmer, and I am the Chief Marketing Officer and Senior Vice President at Ardent, and pleased to be the executive sponsor for Women at Ardent. And I am excited today about our webinar, Unconscious Bias. It is a special presentation between Women at Ardent and Ardent's new Diversity and Inclusion Council. And I do think that today's topic is very relevant and fitting, as today marks the 57th anniversary of the historic March on Washington, where Dr. Martin Luther King delivered the speech, "I Have a Dream." And this year, I know thousands of people will be marching virtually on Washington, as well as thousands of people in person marching on it with a commitment to restore and recommit to that dream. So it is fitting of our subject matter today. Before we begin, I want to just do a few little housekeeping items. If you have questions, please type them into the chat function on the webinar. We have allotted 15 minutes at the end of this presentation so that Luther, our guest speaker, can help answer those. Any others that we are not able to get to for time reasons, we will distribute those questions and answers. Also, the steering committee that helped put this project together has identified podcasts and articles and websites related to the topic of unconscious bias. They are listed on the Ardent website, the Women at Ardent website. So we'd encourage you to go and read those and distribute those to your team members as well. Each of our webinars as well of Women at Ardent, we always start with a connect to purpose, and made a commitment that we would recognize women and teammates within our company that have demonstrated leadership. And with our first survey, we received a number of positive comments and just accolades regarding our connect to purpose speaker, and subject matter, and that would be Karen Kazaya, who is here at Ardent Corporate, and she is our Vice President responsible for total rewards at the corporate office. And here's just a few things that her teammates and others have shared about Karen. They said that she is in the midst of change. She remains focused on ensuring her team is supported, and despite challenges, they remain focused on their work to support one another's and her employees. And they did talk about the fact that she was always there in crisis and ready to support, and a strong mentor to team members and to others. So thank you, Karen, for being a strong leader and for caring for others, which is our purpose. Now I'd like to introduce our new President and CEO, Marty Bonnick. And Marty Bonnick started with us on August 17th. And so thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Tyra. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And I'm excited to see having, I think, over 300 people registered today, which is awesome. But the work that we're doing with both Women at Ardent and our Diversity and Inclusion Council are integral to our success as a company and continuing our commitment, fulfilling diversity, education, and development. It's great to see all of you that have joined here today, and I encourage you to take this with you and to share this with others that were not able to be present, because I think the more we can have crucial conversations like this and understand who we are, where we are, and where we need to go, the better our organization will be and the better we will be as people. And so I look forward to the presentation today and continued involvement going forward with both of these important programs for the company.
Thank you, Marty. I appreciate it. And next, I'm really happy to introduce Dell Oliver. Dell is the co-chair of Ardent's Diversity and Inclusion Council. She's also our chief nurse at Mountainside Medical Center. And Dell has worked very, very closely with our speaker to create foundational components for our Diversity and Inclusion Council. So Dell, would you go ahead?
Thank you very, very much, Tyra. It's been my pleasure and my honor to be in the position to co-chair our first inaugural Ardent Diversity and Inclusion Council. And diversity means a lot to all of us, but particularly personally and professionally for our company, for our country, even for our local community. So I thank you for that. And if appropriate, if we're ready to get started, Tyra, let me know, and I introduce our speaker when that time's ready.
We are ready.
That sounds good. And I've also been given the honor to introduce our current speaker for today, Mr. Luther Wright. Luther Wright was as counsel at Ogletree and Deacon Company. He's been instrumental, and I've known him, met him recently, but been very instrumental in helping the foundational build of our Diversity and Inclusion Council and the components to put the council together. It's been a really good opportunity to build that backbone there. Luz graduated from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, the School of Law, and spent several years of his legal career practicing general litigation, which puts him very close to the mark of what we're trying to achieve, particularly in labor and employee management and labor and employee teams. He has a lot of experience, significant experience in labor and employee law, relations, corporate business litigation, and complex litigation, and including class action lawsuits. He typically represents management in all forms of employment discrimination. Luther has an outstanding personality, very positively driven by his own personal and professional core values, and we appreciate you being a part of our council team through Oaktree, Luther. And with that being said, welcome, and let you get started and take it from here.
Dale, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm going to attempt to correctly share my screen, which I think we are doing now. So, good afternoon, wherever you are in the Ardent world today. I am pleased to have an opportunity to talk to you about a very important subject. I believe with the current events happening in the United States today, in which racial bias, gender bias, and other forms of bias have been in the headline news, there's no better time than now to talk about the concept of unconscious bias in the 30 minutes that we have allotted. I don't think we can have a meaningful conversation about changing people's behaviors in this space or even changing their attitudes about race and gender until we understand the root of the problem. In my opinion, that has to start with a conversation about unconscious bias. So today's presentation is by design a very quick introduction to a much deeper conversation that we need to have in order for us all to improve in this space. So here's what we're going to learn about in our 30 minutes today. What bias is. I believe that a lot of times folks have a misunderstanding about what bias is. I want to help, as one of my law professors at Vanderbilt used to say, some flesh on that skeleton, make sure that we understand exactly what we're talking about. And then we can talk about how unconscious bias impacts us at work, particularly in the healthcare field. And then I'm going to give you a few tips individually for overcoming bias. We begin a lot of our unconscious bias training using the surgeon's dilemma. So I don't want you to think that this was specially created for you. We use this concept of the surgeon's dilemma a lot. It's likely one that you've heard before because of the area that you're in, but it still helps us to begin conversation. Those of you who may be familiar with the surgeon's dilemma, it goes like this. A man and his son are involved in a very bad car crash, and the father dies at the scene. But when the son arrived at the hospital and was rushed into the operating room, the surgeon pulled away and said, "I can't operate on this boy. He's my son." And the question we typically ask as part of that surgeon's dilemma is, who is the surgeon? Now, for a lot of folks, the answer is very obvious. A lot of folks very quickly get to the point that the surgeon is the boy's mother. But I want you to know that when we use this as part of our unconscious bias training, less than half of those who are presented with this dilemma get it right away. And that's sort of the point in this space, because it's an example of gender bias. A lot of times people associate the concept of being a surgeon almost exclusively with men. And while we may not necessarily behave in a way that's consistent with that mindset, we still have those sorts of thoughts, many of us, men and women, floating around in the back of our minds. And while our actions are not necessarily always consistent with those types of biases, sometimes they are. And those times when they are is really what we need to address as it relates to the treatment of those wonderful patients that we all have, and also our treatment of each other in the workplace. So exactly what is bias? And I think that's where a lot of folks struggle, because there are two types of bias, right? One is explicit or conscious bias, The other, which we're going to spend the majority of our remaining time talking about, is that implicit or unconscious bias. Explicit or conscious bias is usually easy to understand and recognize because we do it on purpose. That's where systemic prejudice or discrimination comes from, for example. It is very conscious, and it is a reflection of our social and personal value. Unconscious bias, however, is harder because that unconscious or implicit bias usually runs contrary to our stated conscious beliefs. My slide jumped ahead on me accidentally. It runs contrary to those stated beliefs. Those values are involuntarily formed. And a lot of times we're not aware of them because they exist at a level that is below the surface. Let me give you a personal example. And this is something that I like to share when we talk about the concept of unconscious bias and how it works. Like many people in the world today, and I would imagine with the number of people that we have on the line, some of you are exactly like me in that you are the child of divorce. My parents divorced when I was 3 years old, and I actually have no memory of them being together. My dad remarried when I was 8 and had my little sister, whom I adore, but I was always jealous of because she got the full experience of living with my father. I was just what I call the weekend visitor who slept in the guest room and lived out of a suitcase. And my father, to his credit, was always honest that he wasn't a very good husband earlier in his life, and he was a much better husband and father the second time around. What I didn't realize at the time was that impacted how I perceived particularly men and particularly divorced men. I started to gravitate subconsciously, even in my dating relationships, toward women who had come from a nuclear family, right? That's the family that I'd always wanted to have. Here's what I noticed about 7 years into my career. When I started to look at my inner circle and the people that I worked with closely, there was not a single divorced man in that inner circle. My inner circle was almost exclusively populated with single moms and a few single dads who were raising children on their own. And here's what I realized when I started to look at how I constructed teams and who was in my inner circle. It reflected a pretty significant bias toward divorced men, especially if they had a whole nother kid, as I like to say, and a bias in favor of single moms. Divorced men were going to let me down. They couldn't be trusted. They were going to disappoint me. Single moms, on the other hand, were hard workers. They were always going to have my back. They would never, ever leave me. I could count on them as long as the day. What I realized in that moment was that my work team construction, who I interacted with in the workplace, wasn't a reflection of who I actually had good relationships with, but was rather a reflection of those things that had been floating around in my head from a very early age, and they had manifested themselves in the workplace. And a lot of times, that's how our unconscious bias ends up playing out. We're not aware that we're doing it. It is something that we have floating around in our heads. It's something that we experience in our life. So unconscious bias is triggered automatically through what we call a rapid association of people and groups. And it impacts our attitude and reinforces our stereotypes about them. And even the most well-intentioned of us, and I found myself to be a well-intentioned person, will unwittingly allow unconscious thoughts and feelings to influence what should be objective decisions in the workplace. Or in other words, our information, attitudes, and stereotypes exist in our subconscious, and they end up affecting our behaviors and decisions in the workplace in ways that we're not truly aware of until we take that deeper dive, as I had to do early in my career. We're more likely to act on biases or associations We believe that we are truly unbiased. And we tend to rely more heavily on our unconscious associations when we're under pressure, right? When we have time limitations, when we have personal fatigue, when we're stressed. We tend to recall information that confirms our prior associations more readily than information that contradicts those assumptions. We tend to rely upon ambiguous information to confirm those stereotypes or beliefs while being unaffected by information that proves that those stereotypes or beliefs may be invalid. Let me give you a little bit of the science behind how unconscious bias works, because I think that helps us in confronting it. So at any given moment, our brains are receiving 11 million pieces of information, but we're only able to consciously process about 40 pieces of information at a time. And then that begs the question, right? What happens to the other 10,999,960 pieces of information? What happens is we rely on our subconscious, which helps us filter that information by taking mental shortcuts. So scientifically, unconscious bias refers to the information, attitudes, and stereotypes that filters that subconscious information and creates those mental shortcuts. And this process of unconscious information filtering is a critical part of human functioning. And the shortcuts that we take and the bias that informs those shortcuts often introduce those errors into our decision-making process. When we think about it scientifically, and that's what I really want you to embrace, we're not biased because we're bad people. We're biased because our subconscious routines let us down, and frequently because we're not even aware of what's going on. And so I think the first step in really understanding and confronting unconscious bias is knowing that it comes from this place of our subconscious making these decisions or taking shortcuts for us that sometimes will lead us down a bad path. So how do we develop that unconscious bias? How does that filtering process work? Or put it another way, what are those factors that create that subconscious filter? So if we know that, then we can start to attack it. First is our upbringing, how and where you were brought up, the Northeast, the Midwest, the West Coast, or the Deep South. The media that we digest and absorb. For example, do you read the Huffington Post or do you listen to Rush Limbaugh? The media that we expose ourselves to helps us develop those subconscious routines, as does the friends that we've had growing up or those friends that we associate with and those many conversations and influences that we have in our peer group. The types of groups that we belong to, which include religion. What types of groups are we a part of? Because those things will end up impacting us subconsciously as well as our socialization. And a lot of that has to do with our parents impacting us and how we were socialized, and then how we socialize as we become older. So when we start to look at this whole concept of how do we develop those mental shortcuts or our subconscious, these are the areas that we have to be aware of, because when we're aware of them, we can do exactly what I did several years ago and confront that bias and come up with a different way to handle those situations and relationships in the workplace. Give you an example of how these subconscious filters impact us in simple ways sometimes that we're not aware of. I want to introduce you to Charlie. And I want you to imagine hypothetically that Charlie is a new coworker that you have in the workplace. And after interacting with Charlie, you determine that he seems like a really nice guy. And you've got a cousin, single cousin, who you think would hit it off well with Charlie. But in order to make that introduction and introduce your cousin to this new fantastic coworker, there's a very important thing that you need to know. Is Charlie also single? And so since you're not familiar with Charlie, you ask a coworker who knows him a lot better, is Charlie married? And your coworker's response is a very simple, Charlie's been married. The question I have for you is this. What does the simple statement, Charlie's been married, mean? Does it mean, one, Charlie was once married but is now single? Two, Charlie has been married for a really long time? Or three, Charlie has been married several times? I want you to use the Q&A, and based on this hypothetical that I've just explained to you, indicate in the Q&A if you believe the correct response is number 1, 2, or 3. And I want to give you just a second to do that. Okay, I am seeing a lot of 1s, a couple of 2s, some more 1s are coming in. No takers on number 3, huh? Now, a lot of you have decided that this statement, Charlie's been married, means number 1. There's someone weighing in on number 3. Here's what I want your takeaway to be from this very simple example. The reality is that either one of these could be correct. And I want you to be aware of what I refer to as an interpretation bias. First, embrace the possibility that all 3 of those responses mean dramatically different things, right? A person has been married but is no longer married is very different from a person has been married for a really long time, or a person has been married multiple times. Which answer you gravitated toward is really a reflection and correlates a lot with our age, our race, sometimes gender, and a lot of times the region that we come from. And I can tell you that in doing this training, a lot of folks that are from the Midwest gravitate toward number 1, especially if they're older. A lot of folks in the South will gravitate toward number 1 or number 2. And a lot of times, especially African-American folks who are from the South will say, I need to hear how it was said, because they recognize a person's inflection could lead to a different interpretation. So I want you to be aware of the fact that even when we have basic sentences like this, we can have wildly different interpretations based on one of those subconscious filters. Did you come from a married household? What region are you from? How old are you? What's your gender or your race? Now, the question that you might ask is, why is this relevant, particularly in healthcare? And I want you to embrace this concept that if we can have misconnections about simple issues like this, imagine what else we might be misconnecting about. When we start to think about our communications with and about our patients, is there room for sometimes interpretation bias? When we think about communications with and about each other, do we sometimes have interpretation bias? What about communications with and about the communities that we serve? And how about a lot of other stuff that we don't have time to discuss? I want you to embrace this concept, and I say this all the time in my training about unconscious bias. And one of the things that we can do to overcome it is to become much better communicators, and to make sure that that interpretation bias is not something that puts us in a position where we're sometimes discussing the same things, but walking away with very different interpretations. Another area that I want to talk to you about very quickly is the concept of microaggressions. If you'll remember from that prior slide about implicit or unconscious bias, you saw microaggressions, and that is another form of an unconscious bias that we have. The definition of microaggressions is on the screen now, and this is one area where we can all improve in terms of increasing our awareness of those disrespectful comments and actions that have become a too common part of our daily vernacular particularly when we're communicating with coworkers who may be different from us in some fashion. One commentator has described microaggressions as death by 1,000 tiny little cuts. And while the microaggressions are not necessarily grandiose, when they happen over and over again, this concept of 1,000 little cuts becomes something that's very important in terms of understanding the impact of microaggressions in the workplace. So while microaggressions occur with many groups, they're most usually experienced by racial and ethnic minorities, particularly in the workplace. And some common racial and ethnic microaggressions are displayed on your screen now, and also include other behaviors that aren't listed here, like touching someone's hair or talking over people in meetings. These comments and actions often happen without an appreciation for how offensive the comments can be. And while we don't have time to unpack all of these, I do want to say a couple of things about these comments that you see on the screen as some much broader takeaways. The first is scrub your vocabulary of these phrases and anything that sounds like the phrases that you see displayed on the screen. I can guarantee you that it will increase the level of inclusivity in your workplaces, and it will include or rather increase your ability to communicate across cultural lines. And second, I want you to get out of the habit of debating the legitimacy of whether words or phrases are offensive to you, and respect the fact that they may be offensive to others who are on the receiving end, and that it can literally be the verbal equivalent of hitting someone in a sore spot. Let me give you several critical bias takeaways. I want you to know that we're all biased in some way because we're all human beings. Bias is not a product of us having some sort of axe to grind with a particular person or a particular group. We're all biased in some way because we're human beings, and it is a part of how we function. And we just have to be honest about the fact that we have biases, because when we're honest about those biases, then we can make sure that our biases are not impacting our decisions and our behaviors in the workplace. And I want to leave you with a couple of really good thoughts in this area. Remember that labels are for cans and not for people. I also want you to remember that the point at which your biases define you is when you still choose to act upon them after you've been made aware of them. And I want you to let that sink in, and I want you to digest that. Because when we become aware of those biases, if we really want to overcome them, we have to make sure that we don't let them continue to define our relationship. Another real quick example that I want to take you through, and we call this exercise, who is the patient is where he or she from. And it helps us understand the concept of perception bias. As you all are viewing the names that you see on the screen now, you're probably starting to get some very distinct impressions of gender, race, and maybe national origin. So you see names like Joe, Chloe, Francois, Leah, Jalen, Connor. You're starting to get some mental picture, right? Joe may be female. Chloe, a lot of times, will strike participants in this process as a younger white female. Francois, perhaps from France or a French background. Leah, folks have a differing opinion. A lot of times it depends on whether or not you know someone with that name. There's been a default for some folks toward Caucasian female. Jalen, maybe African-American male, but in some experiences, people start to see an African-American female. Connor is usually a Caucasian male that definitely was in a fraternity when he was in college. But then we add last names to the mix, and we start to get different impressions. Joe Washington now starts to maybe be an African-American person that could be male. Chloe Bighorn, maybe Native American. Francois Ramon still maybe from France. Leah's son is Asian. Dalen Rose is a great former basketball player from the University of Michigan and current ESPN analyst. Connor O'Brien is now Irish, still Caucasian, and a lot of folks have said for some reason perhaps has red hair. We changed the last names again, and we started to have different impressions. Joe's son is now Asian. Chloe Raymond may be from Latin America. Francois Bighorn may now be Native American. Leah Rose could be Jewish. Jalen O'Brien, a lot of folks for some reason start to believe could be mixed race. And Connor Washington now is African American and perhaps from the suburb. Now, it seems like a silly exercise. I want you to know that a lot of times we start to develop a lot of impressions from limited information. And I want you to think about that, particularly when we're looking at electronic health records and patient information. We begin to make a lot of assumptions on the basis of just a little information. And that's where our unconscious bias comes in, because it impacts our decision-making and our impressions. Most human decisions are made emotionally, and the brain has this hardwired pattern of making decisions about others that are based on what feels safe, likable, competent, and valuable. And bias towards what is similar to us drives decisions more so than actual merit. A lot of times we'll default to this idea of trusting our guts. And to compound this, unconscious processing in the brain governs most of the important decisions we make. And the brain is unable to simultaneously decide and at the same time and at the same moment notice if that decision is biased. So that means because we all have brains, we are all essentially biased. And that unconscious bias affects our decision-making processes in all of the ways that you see displayed on the screen now, including how we perceive the world, how we behave, and even how much or how well we listen to each other. Now, that shows up a lot in healthcare. And I know you all are probably even more familiar with some of the outcomes and some of the concerns than I am, because we typically have an over-reliance on stereotypes or generalized experience with a particular group, for example, which could impact how we interpret symptoms and causes. We're sometimes uncomfortable in engaging with certain patients or their family members or even coworkers, which might end up impacting the quality of patient histories or complaints that we're able to ascertain. Misunderstandings and misinterpretation of patient complaints and issues are sometimes impacted by those subconscious filters. We also see some difficulties in shared decision making, right? Diverse teams are great. But what do we do when we start to get that diverse input? And sometimes those communications end up becoming very time consuming as our inability to communicate across cultural lines starts to sometimes even impact the timeliness of our services. And then that perceived power imbalance between patients and healthcare providers, which can sometimes impact how transparent our patients are with us. So how do we go about the process of changing, or as I like to say sometimes, interrupting our unconscious bias once we become aware of it? It's all about intentionality and literally taking steps designed to get you out of the habit of interacting or making decisions that are impacted by bias. So we can't change our upbringing, which is why you see that grayed out, but we can change the media that we digest. We can have a more expansive friend group and be more intentional about the people that we seek to have relationships with. We can also be more intentional about the groups that we are a part of and how we socialize and interact amongst those groups. And I'll give you 5 tips that I think will help you a lot in just a second. So we can be intentional about socializing what we absorb media-wise, those groups and those friends. Another thing that we can do is to make sure that we always test our assumptions, particularly when we're interacting with patients and each other and with community leaders. What are you perceiving about the situation at any given moment? And is that perception accurate? Or is it the product of you making a judgment that's based on all of those subconscious factors that we talked about a moment ago? And if you're judging a person or a situation, Why are you doing it in that instance? These are some of the questions you want to ask. Are you making assumptions, or are you actually interpreting data and letting the data drive you? What are those assumptions based on, right? If we have assumptions that are coming from a collection of data, that's not so bad. If those assumptions are coming from bad past experiences or stereotypes, then we have an issue. And are you filling in the gaps? Are you starting to fill in that lack of knowledge with those things and those experiences that you've had, either from those friends or your upbringing, or the groups that you're a part of, or from how you socialize? Let me leave you with 5 quick tips, and I know that we've done on purpose a very quick dive into some of these concepts. This is typically about an hour and a half presentation that I've tried to give you the highlights of, so that we can at least start to think about these issues. And I want to leave you with these 5 tips and then open up the floor for any questions that you might have. Here's what I think you can do individually to really do a good job of overcoming unconscious bias. Confront your own biases, right? The same way that I had to confront the bias that I had toward divorced men in the workplace, you need to confront any biases that you might have when you become aware of them. If they're pointed out to you by coworkers, or if you have that realization like I did, and just sort of looking at the objective evidence, hey, there's a bias here, and it's a pretty significant one. Educate yourself on different cultural perspectives. I'm a big fan of absorbing as many books and movies and media from other cultures, because it gives me a lens into understanding those individuals in a much more profound way, and understanding cultures without making stereotypes. Do something outside of your cultural comfort zone. A lot of times when I do this presentation, I talk about the fact that I'm a huge country music fan. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. I'd never gone to a country music concert because I was concerned about being outnumbered from a racial perspective. And I decided to do something outside of my comfort zone and to actually go to a Kenny Chesney concert. And guess what? I had the time of my life, and I kicked myself not ever having had that experience. It's one of the most fantastic and most fun times I've ever had in life. And after getting out of my comfort zone and having that experience, pre-COVID, I go to country music concerts and went to country music concerts all the time and had a blast. So sometimes you've got to do something outside of your cultural comfort zone to sort of kickstart that process. Practice discussing controversial subjects in a comfortable environment. That's where having an expansive friend group really helps you. I have a ton of friends who disagree with me about everything, and the only thing that we agree on is the fact that we love each other. And those are the folks that I practice having conversations with about controversial or hard subjects, because I know that I'm in a safe environment. And because I do that on a consistent basis, I've become a lot better at addressing controversial issues that seem to plague us in the workplace and in our community. Last but not least, I want to encourage you to listen more and talk less. One of the frustrations that I see a lot in this area is that a lot of times we don't listen. And remember that I said listen, not necessarily agree, but just listen to folks who might have perspectives or experiences that are different from yours. One of the number one frustrations I see in the diversity and inclusion world is that folks don't feel like their colleagues, their superiors in the organization, listen to them at all, and that their perspectives and their experiences are immediately discounted. If we can listen more and talk less, I can guarantee you that our workplaces will feel more inclusive and our diversity initiatives will thrive. I also want you to realize that if you rearrange letters in the term listen, you can spell silent. Sometimes we just have to be quiet and listen to each other, which is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to be quiet and turn the floor over to any questions that you might have in our remaining time.
Okay, Luther, this is Jesse. We've had a lot of really great questions come in. I think it would be great to start with with this one. What should you do if you think a coworker has an unconscious bias or that they take part in a microaggression that they may not actually be aware of? How might you help them become aware, or should you even do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm a big fan of making people aware of a bias, particularly when it impacts you. And I'll give you a perfect example. A lot of folks in my office would describe me to others as being very articulate. And I overheard that. And it's not something that I like. And I don't like to be described in that fashion because, again, it's a sore spot. And if we had more time, we could talk about how, for me, that term is loaded with a whole lot of racism and placism and this idea that a person like me is not supposed to be articulate. So I said, look, I've heard you describe me in that fashion. I don't think you meant it in that fashion, in a derogatory fashion. But let me give you the history of why I find that offensive. And if you're going to describe me to some colleagues or to clients, just describe me as being a pretty good speaker. And a lot of my colleagues were very receptive to that. They apologized. And the way that I know that they were receptive and that they heard me is that they stopped doing it. And so that's usually what I tell people to do if they're comfortable in having that kind of interaction in a non-hostile, non-angry way.
Yeah, I think that that's great. And we kind of have a follow-up to that question. Do you recommend that someone kind of bring that up in the moment or pull someone aside at a later time? What's your recommendation for that type of situation?
Bring it up in the moment if you're able to do it without it turning into a confrontation. If you can't, reflect on it and bring it up when you've had the opportunity to calm down. My experience is that is a better conversation when you're not upset, reacting to it in an angry fashion. When you can have a more thoughtful conversation about it, the conversation goes better. So I would say it depends. If you think perhaps you're very emotional about it and the conversation could get heated, I say take a beat, calm down, address it later in the day or maybe even on the following day.
That's really good. Okay, let's see what else we've got. A few more coming in here. Do you recommend any sort of maybe self-assessment or something to do to become more aware of your own biases or microaggressions? Is there anything that you recommend particularly?
There are a number of books and resources that I think the Diversity Council is starting to investigate and will make available. Certainly doing reading in that area can help you. There's also an implicit association test that you can take online. If you'll Google implicit association test or IAT, it will take you through a series of tests and it will help you expose biases, particularly as they relate to race and gender. And it's a series of online exercises that you can do that will then give you that feedback and help you expose it. So I've done that, for example, and the results were I am slightly biased in favor of African Americans. So that's what I have to work on.
Right. Okay, that's a good one. Thank you so much. Okay, let me see what else we've got coming in here. We've had a few questions about how do you work with leaders specifically on handling unconscious bias situations. I guess this could be from kind of an HR perspective or even as an employee working with a leader who might have this. It's a little bit of a sensitive topic area. So do you have any recommendations on how to have those conversations with leaders?
Yeah, a lot of times, and I always say this, I mean, a lot of it depends on your comfort level and if you're able to have that conversation in a non-angry fashion. And I usually advise that you utilize your human resources professional. This is one of those areas, particularly when there may be someone who's higher up in the organization, where I'll use our HR professionals to try to create a dialogue or to have even a mediated conversation if necessary. The thing that I resist is not or I say this to folks all the time, I don't want you to feel like you just have to deal with that situation and not do anything. If you feel comfortable having that conversation and you have the rapport with that leader, it's great to have that one-on-one conversation. If not, please solicit the help of your HR professionals from a counseling perspective and from the perspective of being able to give you some guidance on an effective way to address it.
That's really good. Perfect. Okay, well, we have a lot of questions coming in, but I think what we probably should do is wrap up for now, and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can. We'll get them over to you, Luther, so that you're able to kind of provide some input to some of those folks, and we'll be able to provide that as a resource in follow-up to this meeting. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tyra to wrap us up for the day.
All right, thank you so much. And Jesse, thank you. Jesse serves on both the Women at Ardent and our Diversity and Inclusion Council. So I appreciate you moderating. And Luther, such significant amount of information and food for thought and consideration in such a short amount of time. And we greatly appreciate you taking the time. And more importantly, that you're helping us as a company not only move forward, but to become the place where individuals want to receive care and to work. So thank you for that. And we look forward to more information from you. I would ask that you visit ardenthealth.com/women. We're going to put more information. We will work with Luther on helping answer those questions and get it to you. If you've not done so, Women at Ardent is also, we are on LinkedIn. And there'll be continuing discussion there, which in other topics will be placed there. And then we will be getting out next month's topic so that you can put that on your calendar and invite team members. And lastly, I want to end with welcoming Marty to formally to the company, and thank you for being here and being a part of this. And more so to the folks at the back of the room, as Susan and to Rachel, who help with all the logistics for this. So have a happy Friday, a weekend, and look for more information. Thank you.
Thank you all.